So again, cardiology, this is just part one of part two. Part one is more of the anatomy of it, of the heart. Part two, which we'll do afterwards, we'll deal with the EKG of the heart, and the EKG that we could practice on. So, pretty basic stuff. The heart is this gigantic pump that, well, it's a little giant pump that's going to pump blood throughout your whole body. There's about 20 quarts of blood per minute that it goes through. We have about 1.5 million gallons of blood that goes through your body at rest. Think of that 8 times when you're at stress, like taking one of my exams kind of thing, or at peak exercise. It does rest for about 1/4 of a second. It has to rest. The reason why it has to rest is because if this is a balloon that you're putting air into, you don't want to be putting air in there and someone's compressing the balloon as you're doing that. Because if you're compressing this, how can I get air into there? So when it rests, this is the time when the heart is filling with blood. So it has to rest, okay? For a short time, but it fills up with blood. And it's going to propel blood through about 50,000 miles of blood vessels, which you're going to learn all about later on, okay? It's about the size of your fist, so it gives you an idea what that is, okay? The heart functions, it's going to generate blood pressure, routing blood to go in certain places. You need to go more blood to your brain for thinking, so it's going to route it that way. It's going to ensure one-way blood flow. We have valves in certain parts, which we're going to talk about with the heart. Valves are going to make sure if blood is going this way, the valve is going to open, allow blood to go this way, and the valve is going to close when the pressure here is higher, and it goes this way, so that the blood can't go backwards. Okay, so it goes like this, blood fills up and closes. All right, you don't want this kind of maneuver, because now blood can go backwards and forwards. All right, now, here's some generalizations. Arteries and veins. You need to understand this. It's not just now, but for the blood vessels when we get into it. Arteries will always, always, always carry blood away from the heart. Artery away, AA. Pretty easy to manage. Okay? I don't care what they're carrying. They could carry skeletons, teddy bears, oxygenated blood, deoxygenated blood. I don't care, but it's blood that's going away from the heart. Veins will always, always carry blood to the heart. All right, to the heart, T, and veins, V. So think of TV if you want to think of it that way. But always, and again, I don't care what they're carrying. They could be carrying kitchen sinks. They could carry people. They could carry oxygenated blood, deoxygenated blood. I don't care, but it's blood that's going to the heart. Okay, that's a general. That's actually the rule. Now the general rule is that blood that's oxygenated will usually be carried in arteries. Blood that's deoxygenated will be carried in veins. And that happens everywhere except for 2 places. When we deal with the pulmonary system, meaning the pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood and the pulmonary veins are carrying oxygenated blood. The other place where the exception is, when we get into fetal circulation, is the umbilical arteries and veins. The umbilical veins will be carrying oxygenated blood. The umbilical arteries will be carrying deoxygenated blood. Everywhere else in the body, it's going to follow that format. Arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood, except for those 2 exceptions. Okay, we clear with that? Okay. So, let's talk about this. This is very schematic. You don't have to write this down. Just pay attention up here. You'll get it. The heart is split up into 2 things, and we'll talk about next time, but basically the reason why it's in 2, it's really one heart that has 2 pumps to it. It really started off as 2 tubes as an embryo. It starts up as 2 tubes, and then they fuse together, and then they twist and turn. And that's why now in the adult heart, it's actually one heart with like 2 sides to it. So we have the right heart over here and the left heart over here, but it's really one heart. But there's walls in between here. The right heart is going to receive deoxygenated blood, and the left heart is going to pump out oxygenated blood. We have to deal with the lungs here too. So here's a very simplistic diagram of this. Here's a lady running. She's going to use up oxygen from her blood. It's going to be deoxygenated blood going into the veins, going to the heart, into the veins, into the right heart. The right heart is going to pump the blood, this deoxygenated blood, into the lungs. But it has to go through a blood vessel. Since it's going away from the heart, it's got to be an artery. But this artery, which is called the pulmonary artery, is carrying deoxygenated blood. It goes to the lungs. Lungs is going to oxygenate the blood, and it's going to pump the blood into the left heart. But since it's going to the heart, this blood vessel is going to be a vein. That's our pulmonary vein. But in this case, the pulmonary vein is carrying oxygenated blood. The left heart will receive that oxygenated blood and pump it through the aorta, which is a very big artery. And it's going to push that oxygenated blood back into the muscles of the girl, and that cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. That's a very simplistic version of the heart. Any questions with that before I start throwing in valves and other things? Okay. So we have the heart, and I showed it like this. But that's wrong. It's really like this. This is still the right side, that's still the left side, but there's two chambers on the left side, there's two chambers on the right side. Okay? We have receiving chambers, chambers that's going to receive blood. They're called atria. One atrium, two atria. And then you also have discharging chambers, which are much bigger. These chambers are called ventricles, and they're going to discharge the blood out of the heart. So we have a right atrium, I'll just write here. So we have the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, the left ventricle. Okay? So again, embryologically, the right and left heart start as two tubes that fuse together. They twist and turn, and then you've got these chambers. The right heart is going to receive deoxygenated blood. It's going to receive it from the body, and it's going to pump it to the lungs. The left heart is going to receive oxygenated blood from the lungs and pump it to the body. Two heart pumps. Okay? Now, just to give you an idea of what's going on here, the right ventricle has to pump its blood to where? What organ? The lungs. The left ventricle is going to pump its blood where? To the body. To everywhere. Okay? The left ventricle's muscle, would you expect it to be very thin or very thick? Thick. Because it's pushing blood throughout the whole body. It's got to have a nice strong contraction. So you expect it to have a thick muscle. In the right ventricle, would you expect to have a thin or thick? Thinner. It's pumping its blood where again? To the lungs. How far is the heart from the lungs? Right next to it. So the right ventricle is just going to, it's right there. So this is what's going to help you when you look at the models of the heart, the pig hearts, whatever dissected heart you're working with, and it's going to orient you. If you look at the walls of the ventricles, you'll know which ventricle you're in when you compare them. The thicker wall will be on the left ventricle, the thinner wall will be on the right ventricle. As I've always said before, physiology reflects anatomy. Function reflects structure. It makes sense why this is so thick on the left side, because where it's pumping to. Okay? So this is where it's trying to show you two tubes that are fused together, they twist and turn, and you got yourself the heart and the embryo. Okay? I'm not going to ask you the steps here. It's just an FYI to make you appreciate why there's all these chambers going on, the right and left hearts. Okay? Okay, so that's what we did before. Okay? Does this make sense to you before I don't want to go any further if you don't understand this, because we're going to add things now to this. This is very simplistic with this one here. Okay, now, let's introduce you to valves. Okay? There's two valves here and there's two valves on the left side. Valves, again, are going to ensure one-way blood flow. So if this is the right atrium here and this is going to be the right ventricle here, there's going to be a valve in between. If the pressure here is going to be high, it's going to open up the valve, push the blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle. When the pressure down here exceeds the pressure up here, this valve is going to close. And now blood can't go backwards. It's going to ensure one-way blood flow. Every time that heart valve closes, you hear it shut. That's ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. That's what you're hearing. Okay? So we have two valves on the right side and two valves on the left side. The valves on the right side, we have the tricuspid valve and we have the pulmonic or pulmonary valve. And I'll show you where these are in a moment. On the left side, we have the mitral valve, and 50% of medical professionals will call it the mitral valve. 50% of the medical professionals will call it the bicuspid valve. So know both of them. You all understand and know, for you to master A and P, you got to know how to say one structure about 12 different ways. In this case, it's only two. Okay? And you also have the aortic valve. Okay? Questions on that? Okay. The last thing I just want to do before I go through the blood flow is talk to you about something called great vessels. Great vessels are the blood vessels that immediately enter the heart or immediately exit the heart. And they're the thickest blood vessels, the biggest blood vessels we have in our body. We already mentioned a few of them. The pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein. And we also mentioned the aorta. Okay? The other two, and there's two other ones, are going to make blood go to the right atrium. There's one that kind of goes this way. And another one that's going to go this way. This green thing is the diaphragm. Blood that's going to go, that's blood that's coming from below the diaphragm. This blood vessel is known as the inferior vena cava. Now, everything's written on the next few slides over here. Any blood that's going to come from above the diaphragm is the superior vena cava. So this is, I'm just going to abbreviate. You wouldn't abbreviate, but I'm just saying this is the inferior vena cava. This is the superior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood that's coming from above the diaphragm, the arms, the chest, the head, are going to go into the superior vena cava. Any blood that's coming from below the diaphragm, the legs, the abdominal organs, the pelvic organs, is coming by way of the inferior vena cava. It's carrying the same blood, deoxygenated blood, which the right atrium is going to receive. So those are our 5 great vessels: pulmonary veins, pulmonary arteries, aorta, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. We have 4 chambers: right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. We have 4 valves: tricuspid valve, pulmonary or pulmonic valve. We also have the mitral or bicuspid valve and aortic valve. Those items, you should be able to follow a drop of blood passing through each one of those things. I'm I'm not talking about the blood vessels outside of the great vessels. We'll deal with that at another time. I want to make sure you can deal with blood flow through the heart and the lungs for that matter, okay? So let's put it all together, all right? Again, put your pencils down. Everything is up here. Blood is going to, deoxygenated blood is going to go by way of the inferior vena cava from below the diaphragm or superior vena cava from above the diaphragm. Deoxygenated blood from these two places are going to enter the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood is then going to pass through a valve called a tricuspid valve in order to get to the right ventricle. Okay? Again, you wouldn't use the abbreviations, but they're showing the legend up here what they are. So the superior inferior vena cava goes into the right atrium. It's going to open up the tricuspid valve to allow the deoxygenated blood to go from the right atrium to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is then going to push its blood towards the lungs, but it has a couple of items it has to go through. We have another valve here called the pulmonary or pulmonic valve. It then passes through the pulmonary artery. Again, this is an artery that carries deoxygenated blood. It then goes to the lungs. During your wonderful respiratory lecture, you'll learn everything about how that actually occurs. But oxygen is going to go onto the red blood cells, and now the blood is so-called oxygenated. And it's now going to go towards the left heart. It has to go through a vein. It's going to the heart, so it's going to go to the pulmonary veins and enter the left atrium. The left atrium pushes its oxygenated blood past through another valve called the mitral valve, or bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is then going to push its blood past the aortic valve into the aorta. And that cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. I want to show you a video really quickly.
The heart is a pump which must circulate blood through two different but interconnected vascular systems. The smaller of these systems is the pulmonary system. Blood returning from the upper part of the body is delivered to the right atrium of the heart by the superior vena cava, one of the body's two largest veins, while blood returning from the lower part of the body is delivered to the right atrium by the other major vein, the inferior vena cava. Contraction of the right atrium in each cardiac cycle forces blood into the right ventricle. This is followed by contraction of the right ventricle, which pumps blood into the pulmonary artery, sending it on through the blood vessels of the lungs. As the right ventricle contracts and pressure within the right ventricle rises, the tricuspid valve situated at the opening between the right atrium and right ventricle shuts, preventing any backflow. The pressure generated by contraction of the right ventricle soon opens the pulmonary valve and blood enters the circulation of the lungs. After passing through the circulation of the lungs, the blood, having been recharged with oxygen and having rid itself of carbon dioxide, is returned through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. The left atrium, too, contracts, forwarding blood into the left ventricle in order to fill it before it contracts. As the powerful left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve shuts, preventing backflow into the left atrium. The aortic valve opens and blood is forced into the aorta, which distributes it to the rest of the body apart from the lungs. As the contraction comes to an end and pressure in the aorta falls, the aortic valve snaps shut to prevent backflow into the left ventricle.
Let me show you what's going on here. If I give you parts here, let's say the right atrium, if I give you a few parts over here, I would expect you to put in other features, okay? Not too bad. All I care about is great vessels, chambers, and valves, just the stuff we talked about. Now, the other thing I just want to mention, I forgot to mention here, was that, remember we talked about the pulmonary artery. If this is going to be the right ventricle, there's going to be a valve over here, and then it'll do this thing. I'll explain it in a moment. The right ventricle will pump its blood into the pulmonary valve or pulmonic valve. Okay? Now, it's split up like this. It makes this Y. This area here, this is called the pulmonary trunk. And that'll split up into right and left pulmonary arteries. To the lungs. Does that make sense? And if I ask you to put this, I don't care so much for you to call this pulmonary trunk or pulmonary arteries. I'm not that heavy on it. If you say pulmonary trunk, I know you mean the pulmonary arteries and vice versa, okay? But does that make sense, what we got over here? Okay, now, let's go back to this. All I care about in these spots over here is chambers, great vessels, or valves. Just the stuff we just talked about. Okay? So, after the right atrium, what's going to happen? What is the blood drop going to go to next? Is it going to go through a valve, a chamber, or a great vessel? A valve. What valve are we talking about? Tricuspid. Okay? Now, a few things about abbreviations that are accepted universally. You could use R for right, L for left. Totally fine. You could use A for artery, V for vein. Totally fine. I'll accept that. I can't imagine another teacher not accepting something like that. It's universally accepted. Valve you have to spell out. And I've had situations where students wrote down tricuspid V. And I gave half, but then they got upset with me and they said, you said we could use V for vein. So I said, well, what is it? That's a tricuspid vein. So I took the whole thing off. Because there's no such thing as a tricuspid vein. Do you see what I'm saying? V, we assume, means vein, okay, not valve. Okay? All right, after the tricuspid valve, what do you have left? Or what does it go through? A chamber, a great vessel, or a valve? Chamber. What chamber? Right ventricle. And be careful of the last three letters, a common mistake. Some students will write that, and that's wrong. Okay, just letting you know about certain things. Okay? What comes next? Chamber, great vessel, or a valve? A valve. What valve? Pulmonary or pulmonic valve? What comes next? Chamber, great vessel, or valve? Blood vessel. Which one? Right. Now, in this one, you would use it on the same line. You could call this the pulmonary trunk, or you could call it the pulmonary artery. I'm fine with both of them, but don't put it on another line because it would be all shifted. So you could use either or, the way I explained it here. Okay? Then that goes to the lungs, and from the lungs, oxygenated blood is going to go by a chamber, great vessel, or valve. Vessel. Which vessel? Right. This is the pulmonary vein. Then what comes next? Chamber, great vessel, or valve? Chamber. What chamber? Yeah, left atrium. Again, Atria are receiving chambers. Ventricles are discharging chambers. After this is go through a chamber, great vessel, or valve. What valve? Mitral. Is there another word for that? Yeah. Either one is fine. I don't care for you to put both. Just do the one you know how to spell. How's that? Okay. What comes next? Chamber, great vessel, or valve? What chamber? Left ventricle. What comes next? Chamber, great vessel, or valve? What valve? Aortic valve. What comes next? Chamber, great vessel, or valve? Vessel. What's that? Aorta. Then I chose to go to the lower extremities, your legs. Now it's going to go back to the right atrium by way of what? Inferior vena cava. Okay? Sometimes you'll see an E over here. That's just saying plural. You wouldn't have plural here, but when you talk about superior and inferior vena cavae, that's what that is. All right? So that's why you see that sometimes. You'll see atria, this is atrium, and then you'll also see atria. Again, that's dealing with, that's singular, that's plural. One atrium, two atria. All right, so that's where that comes in. Okay? Do you think you guys can do something like this? Now, here's a little twist to it. You're not going to begin with the right atrium. I could start off with a right ventricle. Doesn't matter, it's one cycle. You may start at the right ventricle and end with the right ventricle. You may start with the lungs and end with the lungs. All I care about is chambers, great vessels, or valves. You should be able to do that. I could start off with a tricuspid valve to the tricuspid valve. It's not there to trick you, it's to make sure you understand the concept here. Now here's other reasons why you need to know this. This is the ABCs when you graduate kindergarten. All right? I don't care what medical field you're going into. They will expect you to know this. Like, I don't care what first grade you go into, they expect you to know that B comes after A, okay? This is the basic stuff. You need to know this for any future things you're dealing with in the medical field. You need to also know this for our class for the trace question. Now I kind of explained that to you. If I was going to do the blood flow going from the right wrist to the left ankle, you're going to do all the veins to the heart. That's 1/3 of the test. 1/3 for the heart. There it is. And then 1/3 going away from the heart. Okay? When you deal with cardiology in your lecture, she's going to be, or he's going to be talking about the cardiac cycle, the blood flow through the heart, and what makes valves open and close. If I said to you, the right ventricular pressure is higher than the right atrial pressure, which valve is going to close? Tricuspid valve. And if you don't know the blood flow through the heart, just forget about answering those questions. All right? You really need to know the blood flow through the heart. And it will make your life so much easier when we have this quiz that's happening in a few days or whichever. Okay? When you deal with models and the pig hearts, whatever you're going to look at, once you understand this basic stuff, it is going to just flow. All right? Right now, students are like, oh my God. But the thing is, by the end of the course, students usually say, to boost up our grade, can we just do a heart flow trace? Just do that, to boost it, because this is really going to be something that's you're going to know like the back of your hand. It's all over the place. Okay? Other questions to be concerned about? We'll do the quiz first, so make sure you're here on time. We'll do the quiz first. I'm going to give you, let's say, things in red like this, and then you just fill in the blanks. That's it. I'll give you 10 minutes to do that. You really only need about 3 minutes to do it, but I'll give you 10 minutes to do that, and we'll hand that in, and then we'll finish up our story with the heart.